So we've been talking about how during World War II, Jewish refugees were fleeing Germany, fleeing persecution. They tried to come to Canada, and the Canadian government does not allow them in. And what can we learn from that? And then we also talked about the Holocaust and how Germany under the Nazis treated its minority groups, particularly the Jews, and how they were put into concentration camps. So we're going to kind of move on from there and talk about how Canada during World War II is going to treat one of its minority groups, particularly Canadians of Japanese descent. I like to say that I don't like the idea of hyphenated Canadians, that some people are more Canadian than others. Obviously, we want to acknowledge our cultural backgrounds. I mean, being a Canadian of Jamaican and British descent, but implying that you're Japanese Canadian or Chinese Canadian, I don't like that because it makes me think that, well, other people are fully Canadian, you're only partially. So I like to use the term Canadians of Japanese descent. So we're going to look at war times. So human rights are rights that are given to people because they are human beings. They cannot be taken away. They're called undeniable or inalienable because you are a human being. You have the right to life, the right to liberty, right? The right to peace. But when wartime comes, is it okay for government to restrict human rights during wartime in the interest of national security? Which could come first, human rights or national security? And that's what we're looking at today. And we have to consider that from the perspective of someone living in Vancouver during World War II. And this is going to be important. Canada was far away from the fighting in Europe, but it was not as far away from the fighting going on in the Pacific. And that's what we're going to talk about. The internment of Canadians of Japanese descent. The word internment, think prison, to confine, right? You cannot leave. You haven't necessarily done anything wrong, but we're going to restrict your movements. At the same time in 1930s that Germany is starting to invade its neighbors in trying to regain power, improve its economy, to become more influential, to get natural resources. Japan is also trying to expand, trying to return to the empire it saw itself as. Unfortunately, Japan is a very small country of islands with a dense population, but it does not have certain natural resources that were considered essential in the 20th century, oil and gas. And that's crucial if you want to invade. It's for cars, for boats, for planes. So to try and gain power, to gain influence, to gain wealth, Japan invades an area called Manchuria of China in 1931. This is a brutal attack on China. Japanese soldiers were taught to be as brutal as possible. They attacked civilians. There was horrific details, while the Chinese government or the military often abandoned the civilians who were left to defend themselves. When it's censored, when it's put down by the League of Nations for doing that, they withdraw from the League of Nations. They're not interested in discussing what they're doing. So they just stop speaking to the League of Nations. Here we can see some images from the rape of Nanking, and it's called that because when they invaded the city of Nanking, individual civilians were treated so horrifically, and many, many women were raped. In the map in the middle, you can see some of the many areas that Japan invaded during the 1930s and 40s. Most of them island nations like the Philippines or New Guinea or Indonesia, Malaysia, but even going in so far as into India and Australia. So this was very much in the Pacific, which is close to Vancouver, much closer than Germany anyway. By 1940, Japan had signed an agreement with Germany and Italy saying that they would be allies. They were not interested in the same territory, but they did have some similar ideas in that they were both totalitarian regimes. They controlled total society, but very different because of their cultural background. But you have to ask yourself, Canada is at war with Germany. Germany has just signed an agreement to be allies with Germany. How does that Canadians feel about Japan now that they are an ally of our enemy. To try and restrict their activities, Britain, United States, and Netherlands freeze Japanese financial assets. They freeze their money that they have outside of Japan. This limits their ability to buy and pay for things. The intention was to prevent them from purchasing oil, which of course they need for their military to invade other countries. But this is seen as a sign of aggression in Japan. They are acting against Japan, so they are now the enemy of Japan. Okay. This leads to the Japanese military bombing the American Navy base in Hawaii. This was the center of their Navy in the Pacific. This is where most of their ships were. So it was trying to stop them from potentially getting involved in the war in the Pacific. Although they had sent a declaration of war to the United States, it was not translated quickly enough that the American government realized that they were now at a state of war with Japan. So the United States sees this as an unprovoked attack. They did nothing wrong, and Japan just attacked us. And it was a brutal attack. This means the United States is now at war with Japan. Japan is an ally of Germany. The United States is at war with Germany. This will lead to success in Europe, but it does pose issues for Canadians and Americans of Japanese descent living in North America. On top of this, Canada is also an ally of Britain. When we went to war, some of our soldiers went to help defend British colonies, including Hong Kong. And so when Japan invades Hong Kong, Canadian soldiers were injured, killed, and taken prisoner by the Japanese military. You have to wonder how those families would feel, how their friends would feel knowing that they suffered at the hands of the Japanese military. And how are they then going to view people living on the west coast of Japanese descent? Right? How is your view going to be of Japan when you think about these things happening so close to home? What worries would you have for Canada? At the outbreak of World War II in 1939, the population in British Columbia included about 21,000 Canadians of Japanese origin. 75% of them had residence rights. They were born in Canada. They did not immigrate here. They were children or grandchildren of immigrants. And yet the common belief was that these people were unable to assimilate into Canadian society. Many of them spoke English. They listened to jazz music. They played baseball, right? They went to church for many of them. But because they looked a certain way, maybe they also spoke Japanese at home. Maybe they ate different food. Even the prime minister who bought all the land around his home so no Jew could move into his neighborhood, he himself saw them as having extreme difficulty assimilating into Canada. This led to a lot of resentment from white people living in British Columbia against the Canadians of Japanese descent. But keep in mind that racism has existed for a long time. The war was just an excuse to use it to do what they had wanted to do for a long time, to get rid of the Japanese who were living amongst them. In fear of a Japanese invasion by the Japanese military, many Japanese were fishermen or farmers out at Steveston. When the fishermen went out on their boats, they were afraid that they could come in contact with the Japanese, smuggle in spies, send out information to allow the Japanese to invade Canada. So their fishing boats were seized for fear of spying. But many saw this as a convenient excuse simply to do away with the Japanese fishing competition to allow white fishermen to do better. The Canadian War Measures Act was a law passed in 1914 that gave the Canadian government sweeping powers to make sure that Canada was safe, that people were secure, that they were defended. It was used in World War I to imprison Canadians of German, Ukrainian, and Slavic descent, but not in World War II. By 1941, when Japan attacks Pearl Harbor, the boats are seized, and the Canadian government will use this law to seize Canadian Canadians of Japanese descent their belongings, to sell them off, and to put them into prison, even though they have not done anything wrong. They're going to be moved into what we'll call internment camps. You've got to be aware that at this time there's a lot of anti-Japanese propaganda, some about the war, some predating the war, portraying the Japanese military, and making connections between the Canadians of Japanese descent living in Vancouver and the Japanese military in Japan, in China, in Indonesia, in the Philippines. What will happen is they will demand that all Canadians of Japanese descent living along the coast within 100 miles be moved inland. This will be the most massive movement of people in Canadian history. So in 1941, in December, 1,200 Japanese Canadian fishing boats are impounded. Japanese language newspapers and schools are closed so that they cannot communicate in a language other than English. The next month, they start by removing immigrant males. So males who were born in Japan are moved away from the coast. The following month, all men are moved between 18 and 45 are moved within 100 miles of the coast. So if you voluntarily move to Alberta, you're fine. You can stay. But if you want to stay in British Columbia, you have to go and move inland, and they will control your movements. Eventually, by the end of February, the mass evacuation will begin. Women, children, seniors, they're given 24 hours notice. They're allowed to take one bag each, and cars, cameras, radios, homes, businesses will all be confiscated for protective measures. They'll be housed at the PNE in the agricultural area until they can be moved by train inland. By March, they had to turn over all their property, deeds to homes, deeds to businesses, deeds to cars. This will be seized for their own protection, the idea being that it will be returned to them at the end of the war. By the end of that month, they force all men of Japanese descent into working on road camps, building roads into rural British Columbia. All women and children will be forced into ghost towns or detention camps. I'm going to show you a short video of a very famous Canadian. He's a scientist, he's a climate change activist, he's a professor, and as a child, he was in one of these camps.